So my name is Safar, and with me today is Abror. We'll be interviewing you today for the next series of our Silk Road Survival podcast. Why we do this, we bring that highly academic economic knowledge to the masses in what is done in a way and language. Our agenda consists of three parts. In the first part, we'll answer some personal and work-related questions to get to know you and your works better. In the second part, we'll only focus on one of your research works, which is COVID-induced economic uncertainty. And in the third part, we will focus on another one of your research works, which will be on really uncertain business cycles. Uh, Before all that, thanks one more time for your time and for your contribution. I will briefly introduce you to our audience.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure, sure.
So the two articles you mentioned are tightly related, but one of them is derivative of the other one. So in terms of kind of ordering, I think it would probably make more sense to ask me about really uncertain business cycles first, and then COVID-induced economic uncertainty.
Yeah, sure.
If that's acceptable.
Sure, works. That works. Professor Stephen Terry is an associate professor of economics at the University of Michigan and a research associate at Hamburg. Where he studies how firm-level decisions scale up to shape growth and business cycles. So his work shows, for example, how short-termism can suppress R&D and slow long-run growth. So how disaster-driven uncertainty turns output in the short run, how credit markets can amplify booms and busts when investors overreact to news. Recent projects map the true fat-tail distribution of firm dynamics and show why that matters for policy and macro modeling. He also serves as a co-editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics. I hope I didn't miss anything out. And I guess we can move into the questions in the part one. This will be personal work-related questions to get to know you and your works better. Professor Terry, my first question would be, what first drew you to the field of economics? Was there some so-called open eyes moment that made you realize that this is what you want to be doing for the rest of your life?
What a great question. So first of all, let me say thank you so much for inviting me to chat with you both. And sounds like an interesting series of interviews that you have here. Before I kind of proceed, I do need to note that, in any kind of context like this, I'm speaking for myself. So anything that I say reflects only my personal opinions and has nothing to do with the opinions of any institution that I'm affiliated with. That includes universities or any other type of policy or academic institution. So I'm happy to talk to you in my personal capacity. And returning to your very interesting question, yes, so there was a moment, but it was more of an accident, which was starting my undergraduate university process. I had to choose a major and was going to a school very nearby where my parents raised me in Texas, and decided to ask my parents what they had majored in, and my father was an economics major, and it was as simple as that. So I just decided to do econ then. But over time, although that was more of an accident, over time it grew to be more of an intentional choice. And the things that I view as particularly attractive about the field of economics relative to others is the fact that it combines a tremendous amount. It combines a focus on real-world data and kind of statistical tools to actually understand the world that we live in. It combines that with a rich kind of theoretical grounding that gives a very clear, defined economic way of thinking that's focused on incentives and equilibrium and kind of understanding the underlying incentives of each agent or person in a situation. And kind of informing all of that is also a toolkit that links both to history, to public policy, to current events and projections of the future. It really kind of touches on almost everything we do as humans, for better or worse. And for that reason, I could not be more happy that by accident I chose econ as an undergraduate major.
Great, pretty interesting.
Yeah, sure. So Professor Terry, my next question would be more about how you choose questions. So how do you decide which ideas to chase and which to drop? So do you have a personal rule of thumb for like green light project or research question? And also what metrics do you use to do you research? Maybe it's social good that is important to you or something, just a pure self-interest? Yeah.
Yeah, so this question about how to choose a research topic is a really important one, and one that I, of course, struggle with as a researcher that has to do this on an ongoing basis. It's also something that, every PhD student that I've ever talked to struggles with as well, because it kind of takes experience to learn what types of projects are likely to end up being perceived positively by the literature. But for me personally, I think it kind of relates a little bit to the particular style of research that I do. And the particular style of research that I do is something that has become quite conventional in the field of quantitative macroeconomics, which is that I, like many of my fellow macroeconomists these days, usually write papers that have the following basic structure. There's some sort of empirical fact, some fact that, we can document using well understood statistical tools from some large micro data level. So at the micro level, we'll match those models to the fact we start with. Then we aggregate with those models to make statements about the economy as a whole. And we can make statements about both the things we see and how to interpret the things we see, but also crucially, we can use these models as quantitative laboratories to conduct policy experiments or various types of decompositions in the model that would be hard to get at in reality. We can use the models to make projections, but it's a very much micro to macro ground up approach. In my particular research agenda, I focus most of my work in the area of firms, so businesses that are making decisions that are inherently dynamic. So the firms are making decisions about, or a bunch of workers that they've recruited, or new ideas that they've innovated through spending on R&D. The key element of most of the models I build is that there's some cost today to produce something in future. And so these days, what I'm often looking for when I'm thinking about new projects is, something that starts from a data set. If I have access to a really cool data set on firm behavior, I'll ask myself, what are those kind of ground level, micro level facts that would be transparent to digest for both people who are out there writing lots of papers, ideally also students, and if they're accessible to the public as well, that's all to the better. And what type of facts would tell us something that might push us as a profession to change the types of models we work with, to include new features and new mechanisms and new forces in those models. And if I think I can compute a fact that would be something that leads or sheds new light on a new mechanism in a model, then I've got the first step that I need to kind of start down the path of a research project. But what's also required is not just that there's a micro fact that's linked to the details of the models we use, but that to accommodate some micro fact within a macro model gives us a change in the way that the model behaves when it comes to the economy as a whole. Okay. And so in other words, I'm looking for empirical evidence of some mechanism, a requirement that that mechanism be embedded in a non-trivial, novel way in existing models, and that new mechanism within the structure of a model changes the way we look at long-run growth or business cycles or something like that. And so, I'll judge kind of any idea on the basis of whether it includes or doesn't include those three ingredients.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's pretty interesting.
Great.
Yes, would agree here. So my next question would be to you, always professor. So if you could, say, redesign the first macro course that young economists, like young people majoring in economics, will be taking for undergrads, what would you add so students see how firms drive the business cycle, and what assignment would you use to make it real?
Sure. So I think one thing that has been very true for decades now is that the way in which undergraduate economics courses are structured, and this is certainly true in macro, but to some extent, maybe less so on the micro side, um, has diverged or grown further and further apart from the way that macroeconomics is both taught in PhD programs and executed when it comes to publishing journal articles. And that gap comes from, I think, multiple places. One is the fact that the people who end up doing economics research who go to PhD programs and to graduate work and are the main consumers of kind of frontier research in the field are a very different group of people than a much larger set of students that are interested in getting an introductory treatment of macroeconomics, but don't necessarily care as much about the underlying mathematical details or all of the empirical evidence out there. And so, when it comes to thinking about how to design a course, a lot of it really comes down to exactly which type of student you're wanting to talk to. And the reality is, for the vast majority of people who are interested in getting a little bit of structured thinking about the macroeconomy, some definitions of things they see in the data, and enough insight into the workings of the economy to understand how to read what they see in a newspaper, I think the way that current introductory macroeconomics courses are structured makes a lot of sense. And by that I mean those data sets or those classes start often with very simple data definitions. When you read in the newspaper that GDP is doing something, what does that mean? When you read that some interest rate is changing, what is that interest rate? What does it actually represent in practice, and why do people pay attention to it? And what is a very simple model structure, whether it's based on the very old school ISLM kind of structure or more modern flavors of it? What is the simplest structure we can give you without taxing you too much on the math side to make you informed citizens as you interpret macro and financial data in the world around you? But if you were to ask me a different question, which is, how would I structure macroeconomics courses to bring them closer to the way that they're taught in econ PhD programs? And that would be kind of a course that would be more appropriate for people interested in kind of onward study. I would say that, basically three things are quite useful. One is on the data side, a movement beyond national income accounting. So a movement beyond just GDP, investment, consumption, net exports, and government spending, but instead a movement towards more disaggregated sources of data, whether those are data sets that come from surveys of households that track individual people's behavior, or whether there are data sets that come from often administrative sources on the firm side. Data sets that give us an insight into the behavior of individual households and firms can often be used with some kind of very simple statistical tools to unpack some facts that are kind of foundational to most of the macro models we use in modern research. But then I would also say that it's important to start to introduce, if people want to get a flavor of what research is actually like these days in macro, it's important to start to introduce kind of more modern macroeconomics mathematical tools like dynamic optimization tools. Because whether we're talking about firms that are engaging in an investment process like the one I described earlier, or households deciding how much to consume out of their money versus save for the future, these trade-offs between today and the future are key to what we do in macroeconomics. And something that requires its own kind of set of new mathematical tools and a way of thinking about optimization problems that is, I think, often new relative to some of the simplest introductory courses students get, but very powerful as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Uh,
That's pretty informative. Yeah. So my next question would be more about your position at Kansas City Fed Bank. So you were working there during just right when a global financial crisis hit during 2007 and to 2009. So what's some of the things you saw inside the bank that changed how you think about like recessions?
Yes, absolutely. So, happy to talk about that. I'm going to reiterate the fact that nothing I say here reflects the views of any institution that I've ever been affiliated with. I am no longer affiliated with the Federal Reserve, and I'm speaking only in my personal capacity as a person who at one point worked for them long ago. But what I'll say at the beginning, before getting to your interesting question about recessions, is that for anyone who is interested in economics and potential future study in economics, or just getting involved in an economic policy world, I will note that central banks in a large set of countries often play multiple roles. So in many countries, they have some sort of direct regulatory role over banks. They often are linked to monetary policy making decisions in a country, but then they often will also do various types of economic research. Sometimes that's more academic, sometimes it's more policy linked, sometimes it's a mix of the two. But in their research capacity, economists that work in many central banks in the world often need some help doing that, because they're focused on the bigger picture, higher level ideas, and they need some help from people who have a bit of economics training but can do things like clean data sets, kind of work with them to develop models, or just help the economists with their research. One such central bank that has both at its DC headquarters as well as in each of its districts large groups of economists doing research that is both academic and policy oriented is the Federal Reserve, so the U.S. Central Bank. And I, like very many recent graduates with economics undergraduate degrees, had the great privilege to work for a couple of years within the Federal Reserve System as what we call an RA, or a research assistant. So I was in that role where I was just kind of learning from basically the economists that were there doing their research and helping them with very simple tasks as a person who had just finished my undergrad, as they went about their policy and research jobs. Now, one of the things that was particularly, and this was purely by accident, but particularly valuable for me personally, was that I started working as a Fed RA in August of 2007, smack dab in the middle of the beginnings of some of the financial disruptions that would eventually lead to the global financial crisis and what macroeconomists refer to as the Great Recession in the late 2000s. And it was a tremendously privileged place to be for me, because as a person within the Fed system, I was paying attention to all of this and could kind of see what was happening in real time, but I had zero responsibility or actual need to make consequential decisions. I could just learn during this process. And so for that reason, I would encourage anyone who's interested in further work in econ, but has an econ or data science or statistics or computer science background, to consider these types of entry-level jobs in central banks. They're a great place to learn. Now, for me, I think the things that I learned were that the central bank was willing to, and nothing that I'm going to say here differs from what's been available for years in kind of public summaries of what the Fed did and what it thought during that period. So none of this is private insight into the Fed, but it's my own personal summary of it. What I learned is that the Fed took the Great Recession and the financial disruptions very seriously and viewed them as requiring a stronger and different monetary policy response than it had in the few most recent recessions before that point. And I think a lot of that was informed by the Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke's academic research on the Great Depression in the early 20th century, where his work on that time period suggested that there could be very damaging interactions between financial crises and recessions. In other words, a downturn is very different if the balance sheets of agents in the economy, households, firms, and financial institutions are weak than if the balance sheets or financial situations of institutions are very healthy. And we've seen that consistently in many countries and time periods, that financial crises linked recessions are much deeper. And for that reason, the Fed was very public about its intentions to be more aggressive in responding to this recession. And although the recession ended up being extremely difficult for the economy and financial system, both in the US and in many countries, I think their conventional wisdom in this space would be that these kind of aggressive new types of policy actions, including an aggressive use of quantitative easing or balance sheet manipulation on the part of the Fed, were extremely helpful in preventing that recession from being even worse. In other words, looking back on it, I'm grateful that the policymakers in place at that time took the actions they did so that we ended up with a Great Recession, not a second Great Depression.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing.
Yep. Thanks a lot. So my last question for the part one will be, Professor Terry, what big questions in economics do you look forward to research in the future and why?
Yes, absolutely. So, that's a really interesting question, and I think it is one that is sometimes difficult to answer for a researcher that is kind of out there publishing a lot in journals and kind of engaging with frontier research, because by its very nature, almost all kind of frontier research, the stuff that gets published in very strong journals, is research that is very precise and careful about its contribution and makes a very targeted contribution. And so the things that I look forward to working on in future are things that include the use of rich, very informative data sets with individual firms in them that inform me about firm behavior as they make dynamic decisions. I look forward to linking those to models of long-term growth or cycles and learning something from each of those projects, just a little bit more, just a little bit of improvement in our ability to understand the macroeconomy, both in the long and short terms. And so, really what I'm doing and what the people around me are doing when it comes to research is we're making very small, targeted, and intentionally precise but incremental improvements on the knowledge of things that have come before. So, I don't really want to, speculate about the kind of big picture questions I'm interested in answering, precisely because our job as researchers really is to narrow the questions that we're asking to something that is achievable with a very precise and credible set of research tools.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we could move to the part two right now. So we could discuss really uncertain business cycles first, and then proceed to my questions. So, if you don't mind, I could briefly present the paper just in my own words that I could understand, and then we could discuss. Yeah, so really uncertain business cycles paper asks whether recessions worsen, not only because averages fall, but because the future suddenly feels fuzzy. So when an uncertain shock, meaning a sudden jump in how wide the range of possible outcomes looks, hits, firms wait on hard to reverse choices like hiring and big investments. So that changed pause of firms across many companies slows the economy, even before demand or productivity actually drop. So the paper also shows that firm level or micro uncertainty rises a lot of recessions, such as Great Recession, for example. So I think that the main takeaway here is that track uncertainty It's important to track uncertainty early and communicate clearly so that managers and policymakers can kind of limit those costly pauses. Yeah. Please fix me if I missed any points. I'd highly appreciate that.
So thanks so much for the very clear and I think quite precise summary that did a great job of introducing this topic. So yes, the paper that you're referring to, really uncertain business cycles, has been published, I think, at this point for about 7 or 8 years, but reflects, before that publication, about 10 years of work, both by me, but also a very large team of co-authors, many of whom have worked for very many years in this particular subfield in macroeconomics, to try to understand the extent to which movements in uncertainty on the part of individual economic firms could drive or contribute to recessions or business cycles in the U.S. economy. And so, to start at kind of a very foundational and intuitive level, what you said about the fuzziness of the future, I like that phrase. I think it's quite accurate in this case. The basic idea is that when you are considering the behavior of firms in the economy, it's really important to understand the potential role of their beliefs about the future. Okay? And one of the most important, both because it's fairly large in size, but also because it moves around over the business cycle a lot, components of economic activity is investment. And investment is spending on the part of firms today to create something valuable in the future. Okay? So something like a factory or equipment. More specialized forms of investment could be innovation and new ideas, or recruiting talented workers. But let's just think for concreteness about a firm needing to invest by building a factory and putting new machines or capital in place so that the spending it does today creates productive assets or capital for the future. Those types of investment processes are really tricky for firms to think about and optimize, because they don't just involve, by their very nature, spending today. They also involve the fact that you are going to get payoffs from that spending. That factory will be able to produce, for example, in future. Okay, not today. And so you have to form beliefs about the future. When you do that, you have to form expectations. And for a very long time, that role of expectations about the future has been core to the way macroeconomists think about investment over the business cycle. And the basic model, the underlying set of equations that lies behind our models of the business cycles, has, since the mid-1970s or onwards, looked pretty similar over time, where there's a particular way of thinking about firms forming expectations and how, expectations of good times drive more investment, expectations of bad times drive less investment. But about around the turn of the century, so in the early 2000s, economists started to think carefully about beliefs that firms would have being different than just beliefs about times being good or bad on average. Okay, and instead they started to think maybe there's something else going on that we need to think about that can kind of characterize how firms are thinking about the future. Because sometimes firms can think, oh, I'm pretty sure that, on average, I think times are going to be good tomorrow. But there's a lot of uncertainty or fuzziness around that, okay? Times could be really good or really bad, even though on average, I think they're going to be pretty good. And that world is very different from a world where I know with certainty, and I have no doubt in my mind, that tomorrow is going to be quite good. Okay? In the first world, there's a lot of fuzziness, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of risk for firms. And that turns out to be something that you can kind of try to understand empirically and measure the amount of uncertainty or risk that firms face. And one of the things that economists noted, and have over the last 20, 25 years in the field of economics, is that when we are in recessions, firms and households and economic agents exhibit more uncertainty. They're less certain about the predictions that they make. They face more risk, apparently, and they seem to kind of understand that they face more risk. Another way to say that is bad times are not just bad, they're more uncertain as well. And what the paper you're asking about does is uses a rich set of microdata that comes from administrative sources here in the US to track the individual manufacturing plant or factory level outcomes, things like their sales growth and other changes that we can measure at the kind of plant by year level. And it documents that during bad times over the last 40 or 50 years in the US, recessions, periods where aggregate economic activity has declined, are not just periods of lower average activity, but indeed the variance or the dispersion or kind of the apparent risk, if you'll accept that interpretation, of outcomes for firms at the micro level goes up. Okay, so recessions are risky times, they're uncertain times. And that's kind of the empirical contribution of the paper, is to simply document the correlation. When you measure kind of risk or a proxy for uncertainty at a disaggregated level among manufacturing plants in the US, that risk appears to go up during bad times. That's a correlation. Okay? That doesn't necessarily mean by itself that recessions are caused by uncertainty or that uncertainty makes them worse. And so in the second part of the paper, we build a model where we have individual plant level behavior, so individual manufacturing businesses making decisions about investment for the future, and there's changes both to the level of activity that they face and the uncertainty or the risk or the variance of shocks hitting them. And in that model that we build, we can both match the fluctuations in observed uncertainty in the data, and within that model we can learn that there very much is a well-founded theoretical mechanism by which higher uncertainty would cause firms to, in the face of that uncertainty, basically freeze up and stop investment. Okay? And if that happens and firms kind of freeze, the level of investment can go down, which can contribute to the depth of a recession, but it also can make them less responsive to policy interventions, it can make them less responsive to changes in business opportunities, and it can cause a range of allocative problems for the economy as well that we document within the paper. So the key lesson is that building on a broad literature that had suspected that uncertainty was countercyclical, we in the paper document using good microdata that are proxies for uncertainty on the part of US manufacturing establishments are indeed highly countercyclical, and then that could lead to investment freezes, which either cause or exacerbate recessions here in the U.S. And that's that's the whole paper. So what I just said was a fairly long-winded version of, or a much longer version of what you said very precisely at the very beginning.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you. So just before we start off into the paper itself, could we talk about a little about the Great Recession itself, like in very simple terms, what set it off and how did the housing bust turn into a global credit crunch, meaning when borrowing suddenly became very hard and very costly, and basic things like that. Yeah.
Sure. So, the Great Recession or global financial crisis followed a number of boom years after the early 2000s. So these were years in which financial resources were very plentiful, both for firms as well as for households, especially households in the US that were doing a tremendous amount of borrowing to acquire mortgages. So mortgages are kind of loans that are taken out by houses to buy real estate, so houses. And there had been a tremendous amount of lending during this period of very plentiful financial resources, both to fund that type of housing, investment on the part of firms, but also some of that lending went to groups of households that did not have incredibly strong credit histories. These were not households with very good track records of paying debt or very large amounts of resources. And the idea was that the financial system could handle the increased risk that was associated from lending to fairly risky or kind of less credit-worthy borrowers, often known as subprime borrowers, by dividing up the types of assets that were traded within the financial system that were linked to that mortgage debt. The idea was that you could kind of slice and dice the risk that was attached to these less than credit-worthy households. You could either isolate that from some of the safer households, or you could combine it in a way with other households that made the assets more safe, and you could sell exotic financial instruments that were functions of these kind of underlying mortgage loans that were thought of as safer than the actual creditworthiness of the underlying borrowers themselves. Unfortunately, that turned out to be ex post an example of something that we have seen again and again and again, both in this country, in the US, but also in many countries in over centuries, which is the idea that investors often, because we're human, get this sense that well, if something's going really well, it'll continue to go really well because, this time's different. And there's kind of a famous book that was written, I think, called This Time is Different, that was tracking this financial crisis behavior in many countries and years across the world, and documents that we have this pattern of really boom times in financial markets and in real economies that is often associated with a buildup in risk in the part of the financial system that goes neglected on the part of agents. In the case of the early to mid 2000s, the issue was that investors convinced themselves that they were not exposed to that much bad credit risk from bad mortgages because they had fancy ways of slicing and dicing and cutting up that risk and selling it in subprime mortgage securities of various sorts. That turned out not to be true. There was a lot of risk that they were exposed to. And once a few of the financial institutions that were at highest risk in the year 2007, I think it was, started to face problems from loans that they had implicitly made to bad credit or to people that need to buy houses that have good credit histories. And so you can kind of get a ripple effect through which fear in one part of the financial system impacts credit throughout the financial system. And that type of borrowing is very important for investment and development of a country. And we saw that in the Great Recession. We saw a financial crisis go together with all of this not only mortgage debt that had been accumulated, but kind of ripple through to the rest of the economy. And that came together with a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And I think the kind of the conventional wisdom in the macro field these days is that there's a toxic mix of a buildup of debt ahead of the Great Recession, that came to a quick reverse when a few financial institutions started to experience disruptions, and that rippled through to the rest of the economy through a combination of factors like higher uncertainty, financial disruptions, and what we saw in the end was a very broad-based across both the real and financial sides of the economy, and very deep recession. That was one of the deepest recessions that the U.S. had seen in decades, and that was something that was accompanied because so many financial institutions internationally were also exposed to this debt by a fairly coordinated global recession or downturn, at least in many countries.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a good explanation for the audience just to start it off. So
Sure.
my next question would be more technical. So you studied firm level uncertainty, meaning how unsure individual companies are about sales or costs. So what are some of the metrics you use to track this? For example, the spread in firms' sales growth, and also how did it move in a past recession?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the very difficult things about studying micro-level agents in macroeconomics, and so studying firms in this case in the really uncertain business cycles paper, is that we have models of how firms behave, but those models have variables that have very clean interpretations. It's like some shock that or some process of business conditions for a firm that is either good or bad, and cleanly in the model shifts around the prospects that a business faces for the future and how their business is doing today. But in the data, we don't see those things directly. In the data, we see kind of the outcome of firms reacting to their business conditions that they take as given by engaging in all sorts of activities, hiring people, changing their prices, firing people, investing, innovating. They do all sorts of things that change the outcomes we see in the data. And so, we have to look at basically a range of proxies for firm activities and whether they're experiencing good or bad times all at once to try to get a comprehensive picture of what's happening within individual businesses, because of that real world messiness and how it doesn't always perfectly map to the clean, crisp, theoretical world that we inhabit in our models. And so in this case, what we do to try to, in the Really Uncertain Business Cycles paper, get at measures of risk or uncertainty on the part of firms is we look at the variance. So the variance is just a term that comes from probability theory that tells us how dispersed or how wide the possible kind of range of things that might happen can be in some statistical or probabilistic context. We look at the variance of things like sales growth at the firm level. We look at the variance of stock return outcomes at individual firms as well. And then we also do something that's kind of very nerdy and technical, which is we compute something called total factor productivity at the establishment level. So macroeconomists, for theoretical reasons, have for a long time tried to think separately about two different things that can lead to a certain amount of sales growth change at firms or plants or some unit of business activity. If you have something like a plant, and that plant is producing 100 units of some good in 1 year with 50 people, okay? And then the next year, they're producing 200 units of that good with 100 people, okay? Does that mean that the firm is getting better at producing that good, or that it just doubled the number of inputs and the outputs moved with the number of inputs? Well, it means basically that, the change we see in outputs is accounted for by the change we see in inputs in that case. And so economists have been very interested when we're thinking about data, both for the economy as a whole, but also for individual units, not just looking at raw changes in output or sales, depending on how you define it, but instead some measure of outcomes at the firm level that tracks output, but cleanses the mechanical movements in the number of people and the amount of capital or factories or machines that the firm is using. It turns out that changes in output holding kind of constant the amounts of input are actually very informative in our theories for whether firms should be growing or declining or so on. And that measure in the data, output cleansed for inputs, has a name, productivity or total factor productivity, if you're kind of taking out the influence of multiple factors all at once. And that's what we attempted to measure in our microdata as well. And so we took kind of sales at the plant level and manufacturing plants, and we tried to cleanse the portion of sales that we could account for using their labor input and their capital, so the machines and equipment and some other inputs that we could track as well. And only the kind of remaining portion, this total factor productivity portion, was another proxy that we could use at the firm level, just like, sales growth and other things, to try to track uncertainty. And what we document in the paper empirically is that the variance or the dispersion or the second moment of kind of, if you'll accept this interpretation, the risk that plants face goes up during bad times as measured by that total factor productivity series.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you so much. So my next question would be more about the reallocation. So we know that
Okay.
it's the normal shifting of resources from weaker firms to more stronger ones. So you find it slows when uncertainty spikes. So how much? So my question is, how much long-run damage comes from that slowdown, such as misgrowth, weaker productivity, and also can policy kind of offset it or no?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's useful to pause here for a moment instead of just talking about the particular paper that we're chatting about now, really uncertain business cycles, and instead talk a little bit about the kind of development of thought in the economics literature as it's linked to the allocation of resources at firms and kind of misallocation potentially in those resources. So one of the things that you can see when you look at, for example, aggregate data on, say, the number of employees in an economy, like the US economy, or the total amount of sales, is that that aggregate quantity, which is a net quantity, okay, it goes up during boom times and kind of comes down relative to its growth trend during recessions. But those movements, although they're large enough to, trigger a large amount of thought on business cycle theory, and we try to stabilize them with monetary policy, those are not actually as large, those fluctuations during booms and recessions for the economy as a whole. Those macro fluctuations are nowhere near as large as the firm level or household level fluctuations we see for individual agents. Those are much, much larger. And so starting in kind of the late 80s and early 90s, economists started to get access to, often by making agreements with statistical agencies or central banks to kind of keep the data confidential, they started to get access to using a bunch of confidential data that governments track on businesses and people solely for the purposes of doing research in kind of a controlled environment that was, run by the statistical agency or government entity in question. And some of the earliest work that was often using US Census microdata to do research on firm outcomes documented that, wow, at the individual firm level, employment growth and decline are much larger, okay, than we see for the economy as a whole. And in fact, not only are they much larger in magnitude, these firm level outcomes, there are a lot of gross changes that are much larger than net changes. What do I mean by that? Say that the economy as a whole goes from 100,000 workers being employed to 110,000 workers being employed. So an increase of 10,000 in 1 year or quarter. In the microdata, what we learned is that that net change is often accompanied by larger gross changes. So there may have been 50,000 new jobs that were created and 40,000 jobs that were destroyed for that net change of positive 10,000. And so those gross flows are very large. So there's a lot of churn, there's a lot of dynamism, there's a lot of movement of resources at the micro level, and that is something that is reflected in large firm level outcomes and gross flows that are large relative to net flows. And so economists, because of that, started to pay close attention to the allocation of resources, not just at an aggregate level, how many workers are there, but which firm has which workers? Are they moving a lot to firms that are doing well from firms that are doing poorly? What does the allocation of workers look like? What are the drivers of those patterns that we see in the data? And so this is kind of the intellectual context that we're coming from in this really uncertain business cycles literature, a literature that is focused on the magnitude and size of micro fluctuations, and a literature that then moved from just saying that gross flows at the micro level are large to saying instead there's some evidence that many times the firms that have resources might not be the firms that are the best firms to use those resources. They might be, in other words, firms that have low marginal products for those resources. And we might want to, if we were kind of social planners that could choose how the economy should be, reallocate resources from low marginal product firms to high marginal product firms. In other words, we started to do empirical work and build models of this very precise idea that it's not just the amount of inputs, like labor, that matters, but which firms that have them that also matters, and we care about the allocation or misallocation of those resources. And so in the context of that literature, what we document in the Really Uncertain Business Cycles paper is that if firms are very uncertain about the future and they freeze, and so they stop hiring, they stop investing, then what happens is they might stop responding to things like policy, but they also might stop responding to changes in their own business conditions, signals that tell them whether they should increase or decrease their size. In other words, they might end up holding on to resources that they should be letting go of, or vice versa. They might not grow as much as they need to in some perfect world. And so, what we learn in our model, which has the ability to talk about both the macro outcomes and the micro outcomes, is that uncertainty shocks can make this misallocation of resources worse, which can be something that further exacerbates or makes worse the recession that we're studying in that model.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. So yeah, if Safar has no questions, we could end like this.
So yes, that's basically all, Professor Terry. Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, the time management didn't work right this time, so couldn't do anything. But thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for your contribution. We do value it and we do appreciate it.
Well,
Uh,
it was a pleasure to meet both of you. Thanks so much for running this, and I hope you
sure,
have a
sure, yes,
perfect.
that was good.
Good luck with
So
the
we'll keep
podcast
in
series.
touch. Sure, thanks. Hope we'll keep in touch. Goodbye.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.